So now that we have our whole technique sheet set up, we can go ahead and start to add our watercolor. Now, watercolor paint is exactly what it sounds like. It's paint that's made up mostly of water, so it's very diluted. So as we go through this, we're not looking for very solid colors. Instead, think of it as light layers. So as you can see, everything you are going to need is right here in front of you. We have our technique sheet, our watercolor set, our brushes that came in our supply container, and then the water and the napkins that you supply yourself. Now, this is not toxic and it does come off with water, hence being called watercolor paint. So if you do need to use a cup, you are more than welcome to do that, and it will not hurt the cup, and it will be clean in the dishwasher or by hand if you wash by hand. So to get started and bring our watercolor to life, we have to add water. So I'm going to pick my small or my medium brush, and I'm going to pick which color I want to start with first. So to bring this watercolor to life, I think I'm going to go ahead and start with some blue. I want to dip my brush into the water and add that water to my paint. It's probably going to take 3 to 4 dips to get some water in there. And then I'm going to mix that up. And look at how I can already see that blue on my paintbrush. Now, the more water you have, the lighter or the more translucent your color. And the less water you have, the more concentrated or solid your color. And again, we don't want to look like we're painting with acrylics. We want to look like we're using watercolor. So as you can see, I added almost 8 drops of water to my color blue. So the first thing we want to do is box 1. And box 1 is known as wet on dry. And that means we're going to use wet paint on dry paper. So I'm going to go ahead and take my brush and now my beautifully mixed blue paint. And I am just going to apply my wet paint on my dry paper. And as you can see, my paint stops when my paintbrush stops. So there's no bleeding. If I start running out of paint, it'll get a little bit lighter. But look at how we have nice, clean edges. So you want to take whichever color you picked, and you just want to show that you can get a nice, clean or solid edge with that watercolor. And when you're done with that, you can go ahead and rinse your paint by rubbing the bristles very lightly in the water. You shouldn't be touching the sides or the bottom. And once that's clear, you can wipe that onto your napkin, and we're ready for box number 3, because we're going to skip number 2. We're going to come back to that. Now, box number 3 is the second most common technique. The first one is wet on dry. The next most common technique is called wet on wet. And I'm going to go ahead and write that on there too. So not only do I know that you guys are doing the correct technique in each box, but it's in the correct box also, which is box number 3. So now I want you to go ahead and pick another color. I'm going to pick red, and I'm going to start adding that water to my red watercolor set so that I can start bringing it to life. And if it's worn down a little bit, that's even nicer. It creates this nice well of watercolor paint for you to use. So now that I brought my color to life, and we're going to use all of them eventually, I can go ahead and rinse my brush. Because if this is wet on wet, that means we're using wet watercolor and wet paper. And even though my red didn't come out, my brush is still clean. So I want to go ahead and take my water, and I want to paint in my entire box. Now notice my water is clean, so when I go to use it, I have nice, clean water and clean box. And I know it's hard to see, so I want to make sure that I am keeping enough water on there and staying in the box, and it's nice and shiny. Now this is called the wet on wet technique because it is completely opposite from the wet on dry. So while my box is still wet, I'm going to take my wet paint and I'm going to drop that in the corner. And look at how wherever this water is, it go ahead and spreads. So it's a little different with that wet on wet. So you don't have as much control about it. It will eventually, and I'm going back and putting more ink because I really want to see this move. It will eventually, look at how it takes over that whole box. And any way you move your paper moves that watercolor. So as you are working on your project, you want to ask yourself, do I want more control or less control? Now, the less control gives you some softer edges too. But again, it's up to you. So either the wet on wet, which is less control, or the wet on dry, which is more control. When I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush, wipe it off, and pick another color to get started with. I think I'm going to go ahead and do yellow. So I'm going ahead and adding all of those drops into my yellow. And I am going to bring that to life. So every time we use a color, you should try to use a different color. All right, now that I got a good bit in there, I'm going to go ahead and mix that up to really make my yellow watercolor paint. So for box number 4, now that we have our color ready, we can label it. Box number 4 is going to be layering. The beauty with watercolor is that it's so light and sheer that we can actually create these beautiful layers. So in number 4, we want to do that. I'm going to use circles. You can use any shape you want. Teardrops is really cool. Heart, stars, whatever you want to do. Triangles. Ooh, maybe I'll do triangles. You want to take that color, and we want to make it nice and sheer. So there should be a lot of water in that color. And I want to go ahead and paint that shape over and over. Now I'm not filling the entire box, but I do have multiples of that shape. I do have some white background showing. And now we're going to let that dry before we do our next layer on it. So try to fit at least 4 or 5 of your shape in there. It's okay if some are going off of the page. Again, makes it a little bit more exciting. And we're going to pause on that one. So now that we know that our 2 most basic techniques, we're going to move on to our 5th box, where we're going to use a little bit of the wet on wet and the wet on dry. So box 5 is going to be about blending. And we want to know how to blend 2 colors together. Now for this, I will suggest picking 2 colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. So maybe orange and yellow, yellow to green. I think I'm actually going to do red to purple. And my red is already ready to go, but I do need to add some water to my purple. So I'm going to go ahead and add as much water as I want to bring that watercolor to life. I usually do about 6 to 8 scoops with my paintbrush. If you have a big paintbrush, you might not need as many. That's pretty dark, so I'm going to add a few more. So now I want to start my blending. I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush, unless you want to start with that color. And I'm going to start by taking my first color, and I'm going to put this up in this top corner. And notice we are doing wet on dry to get started. And I'm going to kind of spread this out, but I'm going to leave a little gap so I'm not going all the way to the center. And then I'm going to come back with my purple, and I'm going to come and do the other side. Try to stay in the box. I know I just went out of the box. Now that I have my 2 colors and they're not touching, I can get my paintbrush wet with just water, and I can come in and I can start mixing or blending these 2 colors in the center. So notice I'm rubbing my paintbrush on the paper, softening the paint that's already there, and starting to get my colors. I ran out of water, so I went back and got a little bit more. And I can start using, there we go, the paint that's already on the paper to bring down a little bit and mix with my other color. So we can start pulling that in. If you see that there's still a divide, you want to keep mixing and keep blending. So some of that purple should be in the red and some of the red should be in the purple, etc., etc. If you find that you need a little bit more paint, so I could say I need a little bit more purple in this color. Ooh, corner, look at that. I can already start bringing that in, rinse my brush, get a little water on it, and I can start pooling some of that purple towards that red so it doesn't go away. Once I have it pooled, again, I can come in and I can start blending with my brush. And look at how, just like with any other material, we can start to get some smooth blending using our watercolor. Now you could also do wet on wet and see where it all ends up, but you don't have as much control to get that smooth color. So just like that, we almost have all of our boxes done, but we're gonna hop back to layering. So I'm gonna go ahead and use green. So I'm gonna use colors again that are side by side to put in my second layer. Now to really see those layers in a watercolor, we need to add a lot of water. So it should be sheer. So I'm gonna add more water because when I add my next layer into box number 4, I want to see my yellow layer also. So now that I have my green nice and watered down, nice and sheer, I'm going to go in here and I am going to start layering. So look at how I do that green triangle and I can still see some of that yellow through. Again, right there, I can see some of that yellow through. Ooh, we'll come down here. And look at how, again, we can see those layers. So that yellow coming through on that green. We'll do another one right here. So you get this beautiful effect of seeing these colors through again like they are sheer or transparent. So now we're going to go on to box number 6. I think this one is a little bit more fun. This one is called paint drops. Now for this box, we are going to start by painting the box a solid color. So you can pick any color you want. I think I'm going to stick with yellow. It is my favorite color after all. And if you pick a darker color like red or purple or blue, you're going to really want it watered down because you're going to want to see some other colors when we do this. So again, I'm still watering down my yellow even though I had some water in there. And you're going to have to move pretty quick. So I know that I can use some of the colors I've already brought to life, but since orange is the only color that I haven't used, I'm going to go ahead and bring that to life too by adding some water. And that means I can use any of my colors because I have red, orange, yellow, green, and blue with water in them and ready to go. So I'm going to clean my brush because I want to start with that yellow. And I'm going to pick up my yellow and I am going to paint the whole box. Now you do want to do this kind of quickly. The reason I say that is because we're going to want to work with this box while it's wet. So not only can you put your color down, if you wanted to add some more water to it, you could. Mine's not quite as light as I wanted, so I'm going to go ahead and add water to make sure that it is nice and wet. And then here comes the fun part. So I'm going to rinse my brush real quick. I'm going to take my orange, and with the corner of my brush, I am just going to drop it down. And this is what I call paint drops. So look now, as you have more water, they spread a little bit more. And with less water, they don't spread at all. If you're looking at yours and yours isn't spreading, it's because your background color didn't have enough water in it. I'm going to come in with red. See how light my red is compared to my orange. Ooh, if I have a big drop on there versus a small drop. So you can decide how much or how little you want to fill this with those drops. But look at this effect. You could also get a little messy and you could lift your paper, causing them to move. So again, that directional as you're working with that watercolor. So not only was that wet on wet, but that was also paint dropping. And that brings us to our last box, which is kind of cool. I'm going to have to use my pointed one for what I'm going to do. Even though it's a fat one, I'm still going to use it. For box number 2 and our last box for the day, we are going to do lettering. So you can write your name, a nickname, anything school appropriate, but you want to try to do some lettering. And we're going to do that wet on dry so that we don't lose control of our letters. And then we'll do our last layer on box number 4. So I got my brush nice and wet. I think I am going to do some transitional colors. You can just use one color if you want. And like I said, you can do your name. I'm going to write watercolor at the top. So I'm going to start by just using the point of this. Ooh, see if we can do this. A. And then I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to switch to another color. Now I like the transitional color because I think it's kind of fun, and see how that orange just went in with that red. You want to try not to get too much paint. You can see that mine is almost sticking off of the paper. So water. And look at how that orange and that yellow came together. And then I'll do C. And again, it would be easier with a smaller brush, but sometimes we have to use what's available to us. And I am just going to write watercolor on mine. Like I said, you can do a nickname or anything you want. You can try a fun font, and you can even try to switch colors like I did. You can do your initials if your name is quite long. It's up to you what you would like to do. Again, just always school appropriate. And then we're going to do our last layer. I'm going to go ahead and pick blue. Remember, because we're doing layers of watercolor, we want it nice and light. We do not want this to look like paint in the traditional sense of tempera or acrylic. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my watered down blue, and I am going to layer. And look at how I can see that yellow coming through. Ooh, even here we'll have a little bit of green coming through, and we can see all of those colors. Yeah, look at over there in that corner. And you can see that my first one was maybe a little bit too concentrated, and now you can see the yellow through it. Add a little blue here, a little blue there. And now we have all of our colors. So just for a review, we started with the two most basic techniques, wet paint on dry paper and wet paint on wet paper. Then we learned how to layer, adding beautiful light layers. We learned how to blend two colors together, starting with the wet on dry technique and then adding in that water to blend. Then we did paint drops, which was all a wet color background with drops of wet paint on top. Ooh, and I added a little bit more water there. And then the last thing we did was learn how to write or add lettering, which will be great details when you do your artwork in box number 2. So today our goal is to complete boxes 1 through 6. I will see you tomorrow so that we can finish this box 7 through 10.